Now, several years ago, a friend of mine came to church, and she was coming on and off for a few weeks until she said to me one day, she said, I feel a bit bad when I come because I'm not as into it as you are. Like, you're really into it. And I feel a bit bad because I'm like looking at you thinking, why is he into it so much? And I'm not really into it. And so I feel a bit awkward about that. And, you know, it's an interesting comment. Maybe that's how you feel. You look around and you think, oh, they're really into it. Why are they so into it? Or I hear this sometimes from people in the church. They start coming, they say, I don't really feel it. Like, I can tell they feel it and they feel it. I don't really feel it, whatever it is. And I think that's a really humble and honest comment. I've got a lot of time for that. It gets me wondering, though, what is it about it that we feel? What is going on? Why are we excited in worship when we sing and do all that we do? And it reminded me of something that Jesus said to a woman who made this very public display of affection for him. She poured perfume on his feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and it was this really socially awkward moment. And he said, she has loved much because she has been forgiven much. And I'm sure that there's one reason, there's probably several, why some people maybe feel it more than others. Because they know how much they've been forgiven, then how much they've been saved, how much they've been healed, how much they've been helped, how much they've been rescued. And so, as Jim mentioned, for a few weeks as a church, you're looking at this whole theme of what does it mean to be saved? And the more I believe we consider that and reflect on that, the more we'll respond in love and devotion to Jesus. And there's this beautiful verse in Matthew's Gospel. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 35, it says that Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and healing every disease. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And today I want us to consider that, Jesus' reaction to the crowd, and look at this idea that we are indeed those who are helpless and harassed and really in need of a shepherd. And I believe for some of you today, you're going to come home to the Good Shepherd, maybe for the first time, and realize his affection for you and his ability to help you, though you are helpless, and to lift your burdens, though you are perhaps harassed. And we're going to do that by considering what is perhaps the prime example of God's rescue in the Bible story, the motif and the image and the idea that dominates the scriptures, particularly the Old Testament scriptures, and plays a central part in the Jewish faith even to this day. In fact, every year, maybe every week, but certainly every year at the Passover meal, when the Jewish community and families get together, they gather for a meal, and at some point during the meal, someone will say these words, we were slaves. And they'll retell the story of how God rescued them from slavery. We were slaves. And they'll break bread and they'll share it with one another, remembering how God delivered them from slavery. So we're going to dive into that story together, looking at just a couple of excerpts from the book of Exodus, as we go back 3,300 years in time to one of the most significant moments in human history. Going to read from Exodus 1, a few verses, and then we'll jump to Exodus 3 and start walking it through together. Exodus 1, verse 8 to 14. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. And then in Exodus 3, God appears to Moses and speaks to him these words. And then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, and you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. This is the word of God. And so begins this contest, this great battle between Moses and Pharaoh, between the good shepherd Yahweh and the big bully, between the gods of Egypt and the God of the Israelites. Back and forth they go. And it reminds me very much of a game of chess, which is why we have this here. In fact, several years ago, before my dear dad died, we would play chess together regularly. We lived away from each other, and so I would Skype him. Do you remember Skype? I would Skype him before Zoom dominated. I would Skype him, and we would play a game together, and he would set up his board, and I would set up my board, and we would say things like, oh, king's knight to A3, or whatever it was, and then he would do the same on his board, and they would mirror, and we would go back and forth, making move and counter move until we played, and eventually I would, 9 times out of 10 I would lose because he was clever and I'm not very clever and I'm a bit too impulsive for chess. It requires a bit too much patience and careful thinking, whereas I just like to move pieces and attack. And before long, my dad would say those words to me time and time again. He would say, checkmate. And as he said that, he would often say to me as well, he would say, you see, son, chess is the only game in the world in which luck plays no part at all. You see, in chess, it's either human skill or human error that results in the game's decision. And he would like to remind me of this all the time, until one day I beat him. And I don't know how I did it. I must have caught him off on an off day, and I maneuvered my pieces into position and caught him unawares. And I moved a piece, and I said to him those words. I said, checkmate. And I said, Dad, see, the thing is about chess is, it's the only, don't feel bad, but it's the only game in the world in which luck counts for nothing. It's either human error or skill, or in this case, a lot of skill. And the story of Exodus is a game of chess in many respects. The people of Israel are harassed and oppressed. They are helpless against the Egyptians. And back and forth, Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. And he shows him this miracle that God told him to show him. And it's like a move. And then Pharaoh responds with his magicians performing the same move. It's a counter move. And then back again, Moses would go and afflict them with a plague, and it would be a move. And then Pharaoh's magicians would reply with a similar move, and it would be a counter move. Back and forth it would go on and on and on and on. And we can sometimes feel, I think, a little bit like that with life. No matter how hard we try, no matter how well we think we're playing, eventually some kind of trauma or hardship or suffering will catch up with us. Eventually we know that death will get us, it will win, and it will all go back in the box when it's all over. Israel, in our reading, are a nation of slaves. What hope do they have? What hope do slaves have? They're helpless. And as we saw when Jesus saw the crowd, he saw that they too were helpless. You are helpless against the forces of sin and against the forces of death. We are slaves to sin, destined to die, alienated from God, who, as we've been singing, is the good shepherd. And we are adrift in a vast ocean without a paddle, surrounded by sharks. And to the extent that I think you see that, to the extent that you know the truth of that, is the extent to which you'll love him and you'll feel it and you'll know it in your bones. I want to look at these two ideas, helpless and harassed. You see, we like to think that we are pretty strong and capable people. All the things that we can do, I think Jim spelled it out really well the other week when he just described some of the amazing inventions and things that human beings have been able to do. And yet, actually, we are still just pretty frail, vulnerable creatures, aren't we? And in an instant, we know that things can change just like that. I remember a few years ago hearing a professor called John Wyatt. And as he told his story, he's a medical ethicist, and he tells his story. He said that at one time he was at the top of his career. He was a senior consultant in a neonatalist ward. He was treating and preventing brain injuries in newborn babies. Very capable man. He could handle a lot of stress and make some big, difficult decisions on a daily basis until one day he couldn't. Something just snapped. And he said he had a psychotic episode and woke up in a locked psychiatric unit. And so began the slow road back to recovery. And John Wyatt, I remember hearing him say, he said, I used to think that society is made up of strong people and weak people, and that the strong have a responsibility to help the weak. And I realized in that moment that we're all weak, actually, and life can turn in an instant. I don't know if you can remember the last time that you were confronted by your own helplessness. In our reading, we read that they ruthlessly made them work as slaves, as helpless ones. The Bible says a lot about our frailty and our helplessness. In Psalm 144, it says that people are like breath. Their days are like a passing shadow. In James 4, it says, you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. In Romans 7, Paul says, for I know that nothing good dwells in me. I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. In Jeremiah 17, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? And in Romans 5, for while we were weak, helpless, at that time, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. You know, we are incapable, really, of ever outrunning or overcoming our helplessness. It will eventually catch us up. If you've ever tried to just change a negative thought pattern or cycle in your head, in your life, you know how hard that can be and how helpless you can feel just to bring about any meaningful change in your life. If you've ever tried to overcome any real causes of addiction or temptation in your life, you know this as well. Jesus says this. He said, anyone who sins is a slave to that sin. They're a slave. We're a slave. You're a slave to the things you do but wish you couldn't do and didn't do, the things you think and can't stop thinking. You're a slave to those things. You can't get free. Friends of mine know this who are in recovery from various substance abuses. We run a recovery group at the church, and it feels like in our church, every second person I bump into, they'll introduce themselves as being a friend of Bill. Bill Wilson, or Bill, was it Wilson, who founded the Alcoholics Anonymous. They'll introduce themselves like that. And I've learned a lot from these people talking to them. One of the things that I've learned is that they often tell me, it wasn't until I realized my utter helplessness that I had any chance of recovery and of being free. You know, there's a growing number of people in the UK who realize that, who are in recovery because they've realized their helplessness. Yeah, in the US, it's estimated that 10% of the population have attended a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous or affiliated groups. And in the UK, the number of people who attend 5 meetings a week for recovery, 5 meetings a week, a sign that you really know you need it, you really know you're helpless. That number has increased in the past 10 years from something like 7% to 15% of people in recovery. The good news is that in Exodus 3, as we read, Yahweh says, I know their sufferings, and I've come down to deliver them. Or in Matthew 9, Jesus had compassion on the crowd because they were helpless. Jesus has come for those who need it. He's come to call the sick, not the healthy. And Jesus said, those whom the Son sets free will be free indeed. You know, that voice that says in your head, you'll never change, you'll always be like this is just a family pattern, or you'll never be free from that. That voice that goes over and over again on loop, reminding you of your helplessness and of your stuckness. That voice that says, see, you're doing the same thing last week that you said you'd be free from, you need help. That voice has clearly never met Jesus, because Jesus is able to change and break your patterns of helplessness and addiction. And actually, our own helplessness, our feelings of fragility and vulnerability, we need to reframe them in many respects and treat them as an ally that's supposed to lead us to the great rescuer himself, who's able to save us. I recently read this really helpful memoir by an American lady called Ashley Landy. She grew up in a Christian household but rejected it in her teenage years in order to seek spiritual enlightenment, and she sought it in various psychedelics and reality-changing, altering drugs. She immersed herself in New Age practices and became essentially a drug addict to LSD and the various things that she thought would help her. Upon meeting Jesus, however, she writes this. She says, I saw it. I finally saw it. That the collective hours I'd sat in meditation and forced my protesting muscles to go deeper, to stretch farther, to stay in a pose longer, they were all worthless. The years I'd spent shackled to my lover and enslaver, LSD, the years from which I longed to be free, but from which I couldn't quite unmoor myself, they were over for good. Not because I'd finally cracked the code of enlightenment or broached the final wall, but because I'd been rescued. It wasn't about my search for him. It wasn't about my clutching and grasping or scrabble up the Tower of Babel, piling on litter to create yet another foothold by which I might finally lurch my body into the peace and into the heavens. It wasn't about how I could get to him, how I could storm heaven, how I could lay claim to holy ground. It didn't work that way at all. It was about what he, broken, bleeding, bereft, had done for me. It turned out that the only God who could truly offer me anything at all offered me everything, she says. Ashley discovered that her helplessness was exactly what she needed to reflect on to realize her need for rescue. And then the good news came that there is, in fact, a rescuer. The Israelites were helpless, but they weren't just helpless. They were also harassed. They were harassed and harangued. They weren't just up against a grand chess master that they were helpless against. They were also being chased to every corner they could and had no chance of escape. They were harassed. You know, after Moses' initial help that he offered, Pharaoh, do you know how he responds to Moses' initial attempt to free them? He responds by turning up the heat on the slaves, by forcing them to work, but by not providing any straw to make the bricks, and telling them, you've got to now go and get the straw and make the same quota of bricks as before. You've got to work just as hard, produce the same results, but with fewer resources. Sounds like many of our workplaces, doesn't it? Jesus says that they were like sheep without a shepherd. You know, you and I, we are made to be shepherded, to be led, to be cared for, to be loved. And all of us are led. All of us are shepherded by something. Israel were shepherded by Pharaoh. He wasn't a good shepherd. He wasn't kind. But he led them around and drove them to the ground. He harassed them and bullied them. You know, if Jesus isn't your shepherd, you are still being shepherded and led by something or someone. A lot of people are talking about this program on Netflix, this new drama called Adolescence, which is highlighting some of the negative forces pressing on our sons and harming our daughters at the moment. You know, without good shepherds to lead our young people, wolves will take our place and they'll influence them negatively. In Germany, that's what happened in Germany in the 1930s. A generation of fatherless young boys found refuge in the ideology of Nazism and of Hitler's reassuring presence as a father in their life. We as a church must lean in to help our young people, to shepherd them and care for them, and to point them to the Good Shepherd. There will always be another Pharaoh harassing us and shepherding us. There are malevolent and evil forces in the universe that act more like wolves in the way they devour us and devour God's people than like shepherds. You know, I think the last 20 years for the church and for Christianity in this country has been pretty fascinating. When I became a Christian at uni 20 odd years ago with Charlotte around, I remember the sort of things we would talk about, Charlotte and I and others, and the sort of conversations I would have with people on the campus were the sort of conversations you have with atheist materialist types. They're constantly trying to convince me as the Christian as it was at the time, that there is no such thing as a spiritual world. You are entirely deluded. And as Christians, we would try to reflect and give them reasoned responses and philosophical arguments for the existence of God. And so I got quite used to talking to people who have been influenced by Richard Dawkins and co. The conversations I'm having with people now are less and less like that, actually. More and more the conversations are, we know there's lots of energies and spiritual forces out there. Have you tried this latest cosmic sound bath? And what about these crystals? These are really powerful. This will leave you feeling well. I have a slight confession, is that on my day off, we have a sauna on Seaford Seafront, don't judge me. And I often pay for a session to go sit in the sauna, and we go swim in the sea and then go back into the sauna. And I'm often surrounded by, again, don't judge me, by middle-aged women of a particular type who love to talk about the therapeutic, energetic benefits of the sauna and how healing and wholesome and healthy it is. And they describe it in such worshipful, docile tones. I'm like, wow, this is magical. This is spiritual for them. And I feel like I don't get it. I'm like at their church going, I don't quite get it. Like, I like it, but I'm not going to worship the sea. Very strange. But that is increasingly common. People are aware. There are energies and forces, and there's lots out there, guys. The universe is, diverse, and you should just manifest your truth and reality, and the universe will send it back to you. Those are the sorts of conversations I have with people now, not where I'm trying to convince them that God exists. I'm trying to show them that God is good, and he's the one who created all other forces and principles in the world, and you should be wary of them. As a church, not a month goes by at times where it feels like we don't get some request from an outside hirer to use the church for yoga or, as I said, for cosmic sound baths. What's interesting as well is that between the last two censuses, the number of pagan priests in this country has increased from 54,000 to 74,000. Just for reference, there are 46,000 ordained Anglican clergymen and women. There are more pagan priests than there are Anglican ones in our country. The old gods, the old spirits, the old forces in the world that we drove back as a culture in order to build a society loosely on Christian values, they're making a comeback. And if there's one thing we know from history, they tend to harass people more than they heal people. I bring this up because much of the Exodus story that we have been looking at is a story about the gods of Egypt versus the God of Israel. And each of the plagues that Yahweh sends to the Egyptians to eventually loosen Pharaoh's grip on the slaves, each of the plagues he sends is designed to confront a specific god or energy in the land. So Kum and Harpy are guardians of the Nile. So Yahweh afflicts the Nile and turns it to blood. Hecht is a frog-like god of resurrection, and so Yahweh sends a plague of frogs. Ammon is a beetle god, and so God sends a plague of insects. Apsis is a cow goddess that they worship, and so God sends a plague on the livestock. On and on it goes until eventually, they believe that Pharaoh is a god. And so Yahweh afflicts even the highest god in the land by killing his son. You see, at that point, Pharaoh, having lost his son, on the night of the first Passover, Pharaoh says, fine, let these slaves go. Yahweh wins. And so the Israelites, they gather up their belongings quickly. They haven't got time to wait for their bread to rise, so it's unleavened. And off they go out into the desert, and they think they're free until they reach a great ocean. And they think, anyone bring the boat? How do we get across this? And then they turn around and see that Pharaoh's changed his mind. Their great enslaver, their bully, their wolf shepherd has changed his mind. And they see a dust cloud in the distance as the army chariots are coming to ride them down. That they'd escaped from sin, but death was right around the corner for them, it seemed. And they would have no doubt felt in their own spirits at that time, I thought we were free, but actually, it's checkmate. We're done for. Frederick Moritz was a painter in the late 18th century, and he is a painter who produced this piece of art. It's a famous painting that for a time was hung in the Louvre Museum, and it's a painting of the devil playing chess with a man for his eternal soul. And it became loosely known as checkmate, as the man's face looks forlorn and defeated, and the devil's looking smugly on. And as legend has it, as this painting was hung in a museum, a particular Grand Master came by and saw it one day and stood staring at this painting for some time until he eventually said, we need to call someone. We need to change the name of this painting. They said, well, why? What do you mean? What are you talking about? He said, well, it's not checkmate. He said, the king has one more move to make. The king has one more move to make. No matter how harassed or helpless you might feel in your life at the moment, the king always has one more move to make in his rescue plan. As Israel stood on the banks of the Red Sea and the army closed down on them, they thought it was checkmate, but the king had one more move to make. And a wind blew through the night, and the waves parted, and the Israelite slaves were free. Slaves no longer, but redeemed and rescued children they became. Eventually and finally rid of their tormentors and harassers. And it became such a defining, pivotal moment in their lives that they talk about it still to this day. We were slaves, but we're not anymore. Several hundred years after the Exodus, we find it in the book of 1 Samuel, Israel is oppressed again by another army, again by the Philistines at this point. And a young boy goes to visit his camp and deliver some lunch to his brothers and says, why is everyone so scared? And they said, well, look, this giant in the crowd, he's calling us out and we don't stand a chance against him, we're terrified. And David says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? He marches towards him, doesn't he? He picks up 5 smooth stones, but he'll need only one. Because the king had one more move to make, even when they thought they were done for. Or several hundred years after that again, Israel this time were up against an Assyrian enemy. They've, throughout their history, been oppressed and assaulted at various points, hemmed in at all kinds of times, learning this same lesson over and over again, that God always comes through. He is always their rescuer. And in 701 BC, the Assyrian king, King Sennacherib, had been laying waste to the region, sweeping through their kingdom, taking city after city. There's a famous kind of stone carving in the British Museum that goes round these several walls of the siege of Lachish, which is an Israelite town in Judah, that the Assyrian army had conquered this and celebrated their victory over this. And you can read about it on the walls. And actually one of the boasts that King Sennacherib makes at the time, he says that they destroyed Lachish and then they came to Jerusalem and surrounded it. And there's this beautiful kind of filmic, epic moment where the Rabshakeh, the MC, or the general of the army, steps forward and he says to the king, Hezekiah at the time, he says, on what do you rest the basis of this hope of yours? Give it up. You've seen what we've done at Lachish. You've seen what we've done all through the region. They were done for. But the king had one more move to make. On that occasion, the angel of the Lord wiped out the Assyrian army, and those that were survived went home wounded and defeated. Again, we see this time and time in history, on through the centuries. These aren't just mythical stories, but moments in history that you can see in museums. And then on again to 2,000 years ago, where Jesus sees a crowd. And it says they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And he sits down with his disciples and he retells that old story. And he says, do you remember? We were slaves. And it says in Luke's gospel that he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he said to them, take this and divide it among yourselves. For I tell you that from now on I will not drink the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And he takes bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it. And he gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, this cup is poured out for you and is the new covenant, the new Passover in my blood. He promises them in that meal, a new Passover's coming, folks. We were slaves. You are slaves, but you won't be forever. Several hours later, Jesus is strung up and crucified on a Roman cross outside the city. He's dying. And everyone thinks to themselves, it's over. We thought he was coming to set us free. But the king always has one more move to make. He always does. And 3 days later, on the first Easter Sunday, he broke the tomb and he broke death. He defeated it. And he said, I'm not just the conqueror of sin. Not just can I forgive your sin, but I'm also the destroyer of death. He's alive forevermore. And now, no matter how helpless you are or how harassed you may feel, no matter how aware of your weaknesses you may be, no matter how much your blood has drained at some news that you've heard recently, no matter how scared you may be, the king will always have one more move to make. He is always the rescuing God who comes to those who are helpless and harassed because he has compassion on you. That's the kind of shepherd he is. Not a bully shepherd, not a wolf shepherd, but one who has compassion on you and wants to bring you into his fold, to care for you, to lead you even through the valley of the shadow of death. And even in that place, you'll need to fear no evil because he will be with you. We only need to look at Jesus and live and be rescued. But we can only really do that when we realize, I've run out. I can't help myself. I can't save myself. I'm done for. And to the extent that you realize that is the extent to which you're able to love him in response. Just last night as a church, we had a men's curry night. Curry's the theme of the morning, it seems. And as we were setting up for it, some guy comes in off the street and he just says, I need to see a priest. And I said, well, I guess I'll do. I'm not really a priest, but I guess I am. So are you. Anyway, let's not go into that. And I said, how can I help? And he said, I need salvation. I said, oh, well, why? What's wrong? Tell me your story. And he poured out his heart about some loss in his life recently. He was broken. He looked and smelt like he'd been in some trouble recently. He was not in a good way. And I was just able to say to him, the only way you'll ever find peace is by looking at him. He loves you. And tears came in his eyes as he heard this truth that he's loved. And I prayed for him and blessed him. And he had a big smile on his face and said, thanks, that's exactly what I needed. See ya. So, you're welcome. So you may wonder why some people are more into it than others. Maybe they're just more aware of how helpless and harassed they were before they were rescued. Maybe you need to be more aware of how unable to save yourself you really are. As a new Christian, I read a book about some recovering drug addicts and communities that have been set up. And in one part of the book, there was a comment made about the exuberance of their worship. And the guy replied with what was the title of the book, we dance in worship because we cannot fly. I would if I could. He's worthy of everything. I'm so grateful for what he's done. Let me just end with this quote from a lady in our church who became a Christian recently from a New Age background. She was immersed in all sorts of practices, and on her baptism, she was also filled with the Holy Spirit for the first time. She felt completely free, and she writes this. She says, no song circle, no Reiki session, no sound bath, no cleansing sage ritual could ever compare to the power that I experienced that divine day. Jesus is greater. He's stronger than any power that we can imagine. Helpless and harassed may you be, or you may be, but the King always has one more move to make.